So it's a pleasure being here. Thank you, Erica, for those kind words, and Jan for that lovely introduction. I often joke, Mikhail, that my journey, unlike everyone else who's going up the corporate ladder, mine is coming down. So I started in corporate bank, then investment bank, then mid-market, then SME, then microfinance. So after about a decade in Citibank, in the corporate bank, investment bank, mid-market, joined HSBC to set up their SME business, and then set up their global microfinance business, and then rock bottom with Grameen. So unlike everyone else, which is the race to the top, mine is the race to the bottom. And it's been a fascinating journey of excitement, of interest, and high energy and passion. And hopefully over the next 40 minutes or so, some of that I will be able to share both learning, successes, failures, and hopefully some passion.
Thank you very much. I think that, I mean, you presented it in a very controversial way, but if I would look at the same time at, let's say, the social impact of what you're doing, then it's probably the other way around, that from traditional banking to something that really makes a crucial difference to people on the ground who are in need of these resources, which you, through your organization, are able to provide them. But I presume your talk is going to reflect on that as well, and then we will get to know a bit better what you're doing, because obviously is informed by your daily actions with Grameen Capital. So.
Excellent. So once again, welcome everyone. It's a pleasure being here. It's always a joy, especially interacting with young people. And the University of Tartu was my host last year when I spoke to the students there, as well as hosted by the leadership and the government in Tartu and Estonia. And today we are here to share in a very different world. It seems like 2019 was another planet altogether. And therefore, really, in some ways, this summarizes all of that's happened. There's a saying that there are decades in which nothing happens, and then there are weeks in which decades happen. And really, we seem to be living in those weeks, as Erica mentioned as well. There is an upheaval that's happening across the world, probably the greatest geopolitical upheaval since World War II, or probably the most or the greatest economic upheaval since the Great Depression of 1929, or even some experts feel 1870. So it is unprecedented times in terms of where we are living. The world financial crisis in 2008, which is in recent memory, people feel that this will have double the negative impact in terms of slowdown and recession. And so it is in this time, literally in the last 2 quarters, 2 decades of effort seems to have been undone when it comes to working at the bottom of the pyramid. And so we are situated in a time that is extremely critical. And yet, you know, we used to use the term VUCA world even before COVID. And suddenly that seems very tame. The volatility, the uncertainty, the complexity. So 2020 BC is actually 2020 before COVID. And there already were pre-existing conditions. And we know from COVID that those who have pre-existing conditions are far more susceptible to the impact or to the adverse impact of the crisis. And therefore, whether there was a geopolitical volatility, whether there was an environmental crisis, whether there was challenges around Brexit and the implications on the EU and the global economy, it's suddenly got exacerbated by the situation around COVID. And so the pre-existing conditions coming into 2020, complicated or in a junction or conjunction with the COVID challenges, seem to have really set us back in a significant manner. In fact, recently, Bill Gates said that in the last 25 weeks, it has undone what we've done in the last 25 years. And so we really seem to be at a time where we are all challenged to rethink, reimagine the way we want to respond. And so the traditional aspect is always, how do we respond to a crisis? How do we plan the recovery? How do we build resilience in the system? And yet today's talk is focused on the fourth R. How do we reimagine each of these aspects so that we can not only build back better, and that seems to be the theme that everyone's talking about, building back better. But I think we want to also build back not only better, but cleaner, greener, and more inclusive. And that is why we are challenged to be able to reimagine the way we are looking at innovation and building forward. And to help us in that process, I want to focus on two areas, finance and digitalization. And to be with my two hosts, it's not going to be difficult to remember the key words of European Commission and UNDP. So I've highlighted that. So if those of you who want to remember those themes that we are talking about today, the areas that we are reimagining, they are in the areas of finance, they are in the areas of digitalization. In the areas of finance, we are living in a world that is joined up. That's clear. We are all connected. Again, Erica mentioned the word interconnectedness, and I think that is so true. We're seeing that effect, that a health crisis turned into an economic crisis, which snowballed into a humanitarian crisis. There is tremendous interconnectivity between each of us and everything around us. And therefore, the challenge for us, it's called a pandemic, not for nothing. It's pan, it's across, it cuts across all the different challenges that we have. 66% of the European Union's GDP is from export-import, which means there is always going to be a connectedness. New Zealand, which seems to have the least impact due to COVID, is still having an impact on its economy. So it's very difficult to believe that if we are not building an ecosystem that is together, connected, and supporting each other, there's bound to be a struggle going forward. And in that reimagining of the ecosystem, we are called and challenged to reimagine capital. What does capital look like reimagined? Can we have capital with a conscience? Can we have something called selfless capitalism? Professor Yunus always talks about the selflessness and how do we build with selflessness in mind? How do we create social businesses where it is a business, but for a social cause? It is to be able to create and build and sustain enterprises, whether it's in water or sanitation or clean energy, that are able to build with conscious capital. And therefore, one of the things that we will talk about today is reimagining the way we look at capital, reimagine the way we look at capitalism, and see whether there is new ways, nuances, or even nudges that COVID is giving us into a direction that we can build better, cleaner, greener, and more sustainable, more inclusive. Let's come to digitalization. And we're seeing, I think the key really is the ubiquity of the mobile phone. As Ms. von der Leyen talked about, the fact that we could not even imagine a world trying to cope with COVID without technology, whether you're doing contact tracing, whether you're doing online schools and colleges, as the University of Tartu was sharing with me earlier, most of their programs are online. And we're seeing that across the board, in the slums in Mumbai, in the villages in India, in the situation in Africa, in Nairobi, in Kibera, everywhere. We're talking about the use of mobile phones to track health, education, and various other pieces, giving us, therefore, a really good handle into the way we can reach the lives of others. The other very interesting paradigm to reimagine is how do we use new tech? How do we use the blockchain? The World Food Program, who won the Nobel Peace Prize, does an immensely attractive, interesting program with Syrian refugees using the blockchain. The blockchain is being used in South Africa to help people to go into solar and connect on the grid and off the grid and get their net cost of consumption. And so the ability for us to use artificial intelligence, to use machine learning in the way we create scoring modules, to create predictive Gini coefficients when we are lending, all of these, as you talked about building a digital finance strategy, we're being given really a huge whiteboard, as it were, to reimagine how that new digital finance world is going to look like and how is that data going to be really used. It's often said that data is the new oil. I tend to agree, but I say it's even better. You can even reuse the data. You can't reuse the oil. And therefore, the ability for us to use that data, to use it sympathetically, to use it creatively is the challenge for us. While restricting, while maintaining privacy, while respecting the source of that data, how do we use it for the best for the person so that no one is left behind? Those are the challenges that we need to create, because the person finally is, and that's what people talk about, that with the data, you can actually create a segment of one. And beautifully, all 17 goals come together to say no one is left behind. For not one to be left behind, we need to be able to design products, to design services, to design social outreach for that segment of one. And that is the challenge for each of us. Not a broad brush, one size fits all, but an ability to be able to zero in, to be able to serve every single one, the last, the least, and the lost, in the way that we are called as human beings. And therefore, we want to look at different aspects of how do we build this capital with a conscience ecosystem. I want to share with you our own story. When we started Grameen Capital India, this was in 2007, when I was asked to start it in India, we had 400 million people, less than $2 a day. Now, this was staggering. Grameen Foundation, which had done work in Central Eastern Europe, Middle East, Africa, Latin America, was trying to figure out how do we attract capital, how do we scale microfinance to 400 million people. And one of the things that we quickly decided was not to start a microfinance company, because if we go all by ourselves to solve and include 400 million people, it would take us probably a lifetime or more than that. But what we already knew was there were about 100 NGOs that were already doing microfinance in some form or shape. Many had gone across the border to Bangladesh. Many had learned the model, were doing it in a village, in a town, in a slum, in a pocket, in a province, in a geography. And we said, is there a way, rather than telling all of these 100, stop doing what you're doing, don't copy us, this is our copyright, we did something more unique. We don't believe in copyright, but we believe in copyleft. It is left behind for you to copy. And we will support you in growing, because that's where our mission is, to be able to include everyone and to be able to do it and bring people along. And therefore, we said, what is the single largest constraint for these 100 NGOs to grow so that they could reach more customers? And we identified capital as the single largest constraint. And we said, how do we help them to raise capital? And so we help these NGOs to transition from NGOs to for-profit, from for-profit to non-bank finance companies, from non-bank finance companies to mainstream banks. We actually worked with the governor of the central bank to write the policy to create small finance banks and build that whole momentum around allowing capital access into these organizations. And 2 years ago, when I finished my term as the chair of the Indian Microfinance Network, we had reached 52 million clients, which means on an average, and all 52 million were women, which means about 5 to 6 members in a household. We had already reached 300 million people in less than 10 years. And that, therefore, is innovating, is building an ecosystem, is bringing other people along to create a solution. And therefore, after Grameen Capital, we set up 2 years ago Grameen Impact. And that was to focus on the adjacent sectors: affordable health, affordable education, clean energy, water, sanitation. Because we said, how can we bring the learnings? How can we bring the network? How can we bring all that we have learned to other sectors in the broader, what are now called the impact space? And then we want to look at an equity fund and then a social stock exchange. We're working with the finance minister in India to already design a social stock exchange. We were talking to Pierre Gramigna, who is the finance minister in Luxembourg, and they have a green exchange and doing wonderful work. And when, again, Erica, you mentioned about green bonds and Ms. von der Leyen's intent in using green bonds, I think we're on the right track. We're working together and we're creating really sustainable pools of capital to be able to build back better. And in that, really, there is this whole impact continuum, the whole capital continuum, from philanthropy to double bottom line funding to mainstream capital. And we're seeing across the world a very interesting paradigm of impact investing scaling up. Over $715 billion has been invested in impact assets over the recent years. Mainstream names, BlackRock, Bain, Goldman, KKR, and others are all part of this journey because sustainable investing, ESG investing, SRI are all becoming very important themes as we build and scale up. In India alone, and the last bar talks about India, we've had about $15 billion invested in the impact investing space. There is a new, within the funds architecture under the Securities Exchange Board, we have a new entity called the Social Venture Capital Fund. In fact, we were instrumental in helping to write that policy. And we are seeing, therefore, a whole momentum around what we call the JAM trilogy. JAM standing for Jan Dhan, which is everybody or people's account. So 200 million accounts were opened in a very short time so that everyone has access to a bank account. The Aadhaar is the unique ID or the identification number. And so everyone has a biometric identification, over 1 billion people. And then, of course, the huge ubiquity of mobile penetration. And so all of that together, focusing on the priority sectors, we've been able to see how even corporates and others can be part of that story. So there is a 2% CSR, which means corporate profits, 2% of those have to be kept aside for corporate social responsibility and other activities. So how do we bring different pools of capital? Just yesterday, the OECD released a report on blended finance guidelines. And it's very interesting. You talked about Ms. von der Leyen talking about green bonds. OECD is talking about this. Globally, we seem to see a very interesting momentum around financing of sustainable development. And microfinance is an extremely positive success story. We've seen that a sector that literally 10, 15 years ago in India has scaled up dramatically today to 93 million accounts that are opened, a $25 billion portfolio across microfinance companies. 2 or more have been listed on the stock exchange, one of them 40 times oversubscribed. And for us, therefore, very clearly proving that you can do well and do good at the same time. You don't need to say, I'm going to compromise on profits, I'm going to compromise on scale if I'm serving the bottom of the pyramid. There is an ability, if you design it well, if you focus on building businesses for good, you can do well and good at the same time. And so the microfinance example should encourage us to look at agribusinesses, affordable education businesses, affordable healthcare businesses, affordable housing businesses, financial services, as you talked about, digital finance, and utilities. How do we bring them all together for the common good? And there isn't a better time than now with COVID really sort of throwing the cat among the pigeons of how we are able to serve and how do we build back a better, more inclusive society. Microfinance is not a silver bullet, but it goes alongside all of these very critical pieces so that in these adjacent sectors, we are challenged to reimagine business. And as we speak, businesses are being reimagined across boardrooms and even basilicas. Pope Francis on the 4th of October released his encyclical and again, extremely powerful, talking about how all of us are interconnected, how probably we need to reimagine the way we serve our people, how important it is to dream together, how can we serve everyone. And exactly a year ago in August 2019, 181 CEOs sat in their boardrooms, came together and said, we will sign, probably different to what Friedman talked about, where he said the business of business is business. He's saying each of us in our individual companies serves our corporate purpose, share a fundamental commitment to all our stakeholders. Purpose is not the sole pursuit of profits, but an animating force for achieving them. You cannot divorce any more profits from purpose. It's impossible to build a sustainable organization without investing in employees, being customer-centric, ethical supply chains, and having the environment and sustainability at the core of your operations. And so we are being challenged to reimagine the way we design business, reimagine the way we design finance, but most importantly, reimagine the way we work with the poorest of the poor. Because as we are seeing today, and estimates seem to range between 100 million to 500 million people who could fall below the poverty line because of the last 6 months. Now, how just tragic is that? The fact that 25 years of work seem to be eroded, literally in 25 weeks. How can we therefore put our heads together, put our shoulders to the wheel together, and put our minds together above all, put our hearts together to be able to create a solution to be able to finance this huge gaping hole. 2 years ago, when I was at the UN General Assembly and speaking there in September, the first thing that struck me was the need for $30 trillion to finance the SDG gap. And it was very humbling to be able to, first of all, address that August forum. But the fact that we are seeing this huge shortfall, and a bulk of these are gaps in the global south. How do we create, therefore, as Dr. Shamshad Akhtar says, innovations that can divert private capital towards development? And two things really struck me. One, $30 trillion is an enormous shortfall. And coming post-COVID, we seem to see that number inching towards $40 trillion. Where is that money going to come from? How do we create pools of capital that can attract that money? And therefore, I was encouraged because we saw the same story in microfinance. We saw a $50 billion need, and at that time it was less than 5 billion of supply. And yet we were able to scale that close to $30 billion in 10 years' time. So it is possible if we create market-based solutions. It is possible if we can attract mainstream capital. But how do we attract mainstream capital if they don't know that there is a treasure at the bottom of the pyramid, that there is a sustainable business model that exists there? And that's the role of where philanthropy, where governments, where donor money, where CSR comes in, to be able to de-risk these financial structures by blending pools of capital. When CSR or grant funding takes the junior note or takes the bigger risk and allows mainstream capital to taste the risk, to learn the risk, to appreciate the risk, and then price the risk. And I think that's what struck me at the UN when I then committed to look at what was then being touted as impact bonds. And impact bonds are sustainable social impact bonds, the development impact bonds that were there 2 years ago. But one of the things was not sounding right. It was not philosophically sort of resonating with me because it was taking 2 to 3 years to get a single bond done. And everyone wanted to do $100 million bonds or $500 million bonds. And yet from our learning at the bottom of the pyramid, you need to be small, you need to be quick because you're dealing with vulnerable populations who don't have the luxury of waiting for 2 to 3 years. And so we committed to build micro bonds, SDG impact bonds within 3 months instead of 3 years. And as they say, the rest is history. We created a product called the SDG impact bonds, where we said we will find the outcome funder after the project is put in place, and they will then pay for those outcomes and refinance the debt or the impact investor. And we launched them within 3 months. Every 3 months since I spoke at the General Assembly in September 2018, we have launched an impact bond. We did the first one on Goal 5, focused on women's empowerment, to train 2,000 tribal women to become poultry farmers. We did the second one focused on Goal 8, to place 20,000 young people in jobs after skilling and training them. And this has been a huge success because this is the first bond done with for-profit enterprises. Till then, most of the impact bonds were done with NGOs. But we felt that if we can build an impact bond for-profit companies and have outcome funders pay the coupon, then it helps them to get cheaper debt, zero coupon debt, and help them to scale much quicker than an NGO would. And so we were successful again in being able to do the Goal 8 bond on livelihoods. We then launched a combination of 5 and 8 together for women's livelihoods and women entrepreneurship, where we made women's weavers create their own brands of carpets or rugs or dharis. We then did a Goal 7 bond on clean energy. We then did a bond on Goal 2 for food security and agriculture, where we are looking at, creating sustainable agricultural solutions. And finally, a month ago, we did a COVID impact bond focused on women's artisans making products like masks or sanitizers that are needed for COVID. So we want to create really an SDG bond factory that we can bring to market, get investors to come in, get CSR to be the outcome funder, get philanthropists or get foundations to underwrite these bonds to provide the risk guarantees so that capital can come in from mainstream sources. We started with $1 million in phase 1, $1 million to $2 million for a micro bond. We want to go to 10x of that to $20 million, where we will have co-investors investing with us in the bonds. And hopefully in phase 3, $200 million, where we will list these on a social stock exchange. So that is really the dream. And so to summarize, I just want to talk about one last way of how we can relook at creating this. This is some publicity that we got. I was with black hair. COVID clearly has had its impact. But the fact is, and I want to leave you with this, easy to understand again, using the word Tartu, how do we create and reimagine financing the SDGs? A, using technology, building technology, and Albert Einstein is sort of said to have mentioned that it has become appalling that our technology has exceeded our humanity. And I want to keep that in mind, because if we divorce technology from humanity, then we have only failure staring at us. Second, measurement. Absolutely critical in bonds or any financing instrument, the ability to measure. We have seen a lot of greenwashing and then impact washing and now SDG washing. We often wear the pin, and I say, pin there, done that is not necessarily true. Just because you wear the pin or put the flag is not enough. We need to roll up our sleeves and be there measuring impact at every level. Results-based financing is the new paradigm. How do we move into that paradigm? We don't put money to build a school, but we put money to pay for learning outcomes. We don't put money to build a hospital, but we pay for health outcomes. We don't put money to set up solar projects, but we pay for decarbonization. So moving away from paying for input to paying for outcomes or results. And we talked about this earlier, a total ecosystem approach where everyone's connected, everyone's bringing solutions, policymakers, government, private sector, public sector, students, universities, all putting their heads together to make sure no one is left behind. I do want to end with what Mr. Kapuscinski himself was called, the voice of the poor. If we are able to put the voice of the poor at the heart of our work, if we are able to make sure that no one is left behind, then we can build back better, cleaner, greener, and more inclusive. Thank you for your attention.
Do I get it correctly that essentially what you're saying that the solution that you have been providing is basically solving an information problem, that there is actually a business model for doing well and doing good at the same time? The reason why we haven't really seen that is because the resources haven't really seen where the need is and haven't really connected there. So if that is an informational problem, then the wider question I have is, let's say, this microfinance solution, which you have been able to scale. And that is the sort of the most important takeaway for me here, how to find ways to scale these good models. And this tends to be, let's say, especially in policy design, the #1 problem. I mean, we know what works, how to scale that. Is the sort of the main lesson learned from this is that you actually show that there's an ecosystem that sort of is self-scaling and brings the result, or I mean, the impact usually obviously comes from behavioral change. So it's not the ecosystem, but actually how to incentivize people to do these crucial changes in behavior that are going to bring us the effect, or is it both? I mean, the ecosystem plus these mechanisms to change behavior.
So I have a naughty answer for you, and then I'll give you the right answer. I think the naughty answer is to get a Nobel Peace Prize. Once you get it, then everyone gets aware of it, and it becomes well known. But it's interesting, and I'm saying it now even seriously. If you see the trajectory, 2006, Professor Yunus won the Nobel Peace Prize. Grameen Bank shared it with him. 2007, the United Nations declared it the year of microcredit, and then it just took off. So I think it's important for us to be able to give recognition, to be able to come onto a common platform and talk about it. And I see the SDGs having a similar momentum. I remember it was launched at the UN, and Pope Francis was there, and they talked about this is a moment of hope for the world. And we need to be constantly talking about the SDGs. We need to be recalibrating our work. Even our COVID response should be measured on the SDGs. We seem to have forgotten it. COVID has distracted everyone. And in fact, it's actually an important moment where we can look at the SDGs and build block by block, brick by brick, by putting the momentum together. So the short answer, Mikhail, it needs recognition. It needs a global platform. We have world leaders today that are supportive, but again, our world leaders are in a dichotomy. I think it's up to the civil citizens now, civil society, to stand up and create our own networks. It's up to the universities, for example, Tartu, to create your own networks. It's important that people stand up and take the world and its future in their own hands.
Would you say that, let's say, the model which you have designed, which clearly seems to work in terms of, let's say, addressing one particular SDG, mainly, let's say, no poverty, that we can take this model and change the main, not change for this particular solution, but use it to address another very pressing SDG, climate action, climate change. Is that model somehow in an abstract level also applicable there? Because when I think about the nature of the problem, it's very similar. I mean, the change comes from the individual behavior, but at the same time, how do well, do good for the climate? I mean, keep your, let's say, standard of living or improve that, but not at the expense of the climate. So how to solve that puzzle there as well? Could you think, or I mean, let me pick your brain here a bit. Do you see that this could be applicable for this?
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, I was just picking up my phone because I got a message from the first minister in Latin America, which is the Ministry for Climate Change. There is a new ministry got created in Argentina. Patricio Lombardi is that minister. And we are trying to create an SDG 7 impact bond that cuts across communities working or living in forests. How do we create an ecosystem for those communities? How can we make them support the forest and yet get their livelihoods? And if we can create a bond which is looking at green cover, for example, and I know Jeffrey Sachs talks about using drones and satellites to map and to measure green cover. And if that can be the outcome for the outcome bond, then we should be able to go to large corporations like Shell or go to climate funds and say, you be the outcome funder. If we can provide funding to women in communities working in the forest, who live in the forest, so that they can take care of the forest and the forest take care of them. And that livelihoods product, whether it's in the jungles in Brazil or Argentina, whether it's in Papua New Guinea, whether it's in Jharkhand in India, or somewhere in Africa, we create a global South bond. And the ability then to be able to catalyze this is far more compelling.
Thank you. And actually, you were looking at the questions from the audience, which have been submitted at the moment. I see that we basically answered already one of them as well. This clean energy bond, essentially. I mean, how you package that problem into this particular solution to it, and there seems to be, at least, I mean, we should try it. it seems to be something that might be working. But the question from the audience related to this is actually how to measure this this outcome. When you say that we should pay for outcomes, not inputs, and then when we're talking about clean energy bonds, then how would you measure that? Would it be possible to somehow do it?
Yeah, so I'll spend a minute first on the earlier question again for a little more detail. One of the things that we are looking at is making micro bonds. And I think it's different from an approach of the one that probably Erica talked about earlier in the green bonds. Most of the green bonds seem to be $500 million, $5 billion, $50 billion, and large projects. And we're trying, and there's nothing wrong with that. Those should continue. But we're saying, can we create a groundswell of movement? Can we create many such small projects for a wind farm, for a solar project, or a reforestation project, and allow many of those to come together rather than have just one large ticket size? Because the moment you build a large 100 million or $100 billion bond, it's very difficult to reach the real lives of the real people at the bottom. And therefore, we come to measurement. For example, in the Goal 5 bond, which we did, which was to train 2,000 tribal women to become poultry farmers. We actually put the number of chickens, the number of coops built, the training hours given to the women, the market linkages, and the household income of the woman after starting that activity. All of those were outcomes that we defined before the project started. So we put the outcomes up front. And then at every stage, we measure against those outcomes. And we find outcome funders who are committed to those outcomes. So who are the natural allies is very important. For example, in a women's bond, the natural ally could be a Unilever or a Johnson & Johnson or a Procter & Gamble. For a clean energy bond, it may be a Shell or one of the large corporations. For a food security bond, it could be a Nestle, or it could be, again, a food company or Kraft. For a bond on health, it could be Novartis or a healthcare company. So we need to create very specific products and smaller ecosystems for each bond. And therefore, I'm keeping on stressing everything we do, we need to come back. And there are not only 17 goals, there are 169 indicators behind that. And people, like to talk about the 17 and know them by heart. But below those are those indicators. And if we can map outcomes to those indicators and then measure those indicators. And the one who taught me all of this was actually Achim Steiner, in the UNDP when we met speaking at the General Assembly in 2018. So the need for us to be able to articulate, to be able to define, and then to be able to measure is absolutely critical.
Mm-hmm. Okay, then following up on that question seems to be related to what you just said in the questions that the audience is putting to us, is that if I look at the solutions you are advocating, they seem to be bringing, let's say, outsized effects in the poorer countries or the very poorest, let's say, segment of the population. Could these solutions potentially be used also, let's say, in mid-income countries or mid-income population segments? Because depending obviously on the circumstances, but these tend to be actually relatively nominally very large either populations or segments. So actually, when we really truly want to make an aggregated large impact, not only outsized impacts at the lower level of the bottom of the pyramid, as you were saying, would these work in mid-income countries as well, or is it sort of applicable there as well?
So I think I'm reminded of my time in Estonia last year, where we met some very young, bright startups. And there's a huge technology boom in Estonia, both in Tallinn and in Tartu. And we met young entrepreneurs who are creating health apps, fintech apps, and a whole new product range coming out of technology. And so again, the challenge there is, how do you mix them or mesh them with the SDGs? If at all that's your intent. And if you don't, that's also fine. I mean, business is needed across the spectrum. But if you want to build a sustainable business, if you want to build a meaningful business, then it's good to build it with the SDGs in mind, because that's where we see the world changing towards. And therefore, it's not necessarily where there are large, pockets of poverty or large populations that this works alone. You can still build a social enterprise. You can still build a social business. We have examples of Grameen Danone, Grameen Adidas, Grameen Veolia, Grameen BASF. So many, many companies, each one focused on one need. Grameen Danone on malnourishment. Grameen Adidas to be able to create footwear for those who go without footwear, and therefore, their feet crack and the worms enter through the body, into the body from the cracks in the feet. Or Grameen BASF for malaria and mosquito nets that are chemically treated. So the ability for us to create a business solution for a social problem is universal. Mid-income countries, rich countries, or poor countries. It doesn't matter. The mindset matters, and the passion matters, and the heart to be able to do this matters.
Thank you. Now, again, following up, let's say this model seems to be sort of scalable and usable with slight adjustments in very different settings to address quite different problems all over under this SDG umbrella. There's a question from the audience that sort of moves towards more maybe getting advice from a banker, from a very special banker that let's say when you are a philanthropist, you put your money where you believe it makes a difference, and you don't really sort of, I mean, you're only accountable to yourself. But when there's a international development organization or partner that usually uses some sort of taxpayer money coming from somewhere, there is a need to be accountable down to the very last cent. How is that, let's say, reconcilable with a model that would like to achieve its results with having millions of small projects? It becomes a bit sort of more problematic. And what would you sort of recommend? How would that work when you have a lot of these potential losses, obviously, as well, but at the same time ensuring accountability?
That's an excellent question. So congratulations to whoever answered that. And I think the best way, the best thing you can do as a banker is to be a good banker. So you should not compromise on risk. You should not compromise on the quality of the portfolio. However, can you also be a creative banker and see, is there a way to de-risk your portfolio by finding a natural ally? And I'm keeping on repeating this many times because that's what blended finance is. How do you blend different motivations of capital into a single instrument? And I'll give you an example. Rockefeller Foundation, he was working with Grameen Foundation to try and help to scale up microfinance. And there was a big push. And I remember someone came to us and said, there's a foundation who wants to give $5 million for microfinance in India. Please give it to a microfinance company. And we said, no, first they said, please take this money. And we said, no. They said, please take this money. We don't take anyone's money. We create structures and we allow the capital to flow. And we said, no. And then they were insistent that we give it to a microfinance company who could give it as a grant. And we said, if you are insisting, we will suggest a structure. You keep the money with you in New York. Let Citibank New York give a bank guarantee to a local bank in India. That local bank in India will lend money to a microfinance company because they are fully guaranteed. So they are not taking any risk. They have a line on Citibank. They have Citibank credit lines. There's no problem there. They will lend to a microfinance company. The microfinance company will break it up into small $20, $50 and give it out to thousands of women. We know the model works. So the model will work. They will repay the microfinance company. The microfinance company will repay the bank, and the guarantee in Citibank doesn't get used. So we then give it to another bank in India, and they give it to another microfinance company, and that cycle happens again. And then we give it to a third bank. So from the same 5 million, we were able to catalyze $150 million to different banks and different microfinance companies because we were able to de-risk. Now, look at what happened to the first bank. The first bank got a whole credit cycle, got the whole track record, got the whole experience, and the next time they didn't need the guarantee. So slowly, every bank began to lend without the guarantee because they understood the risk. So all we are saying is, initially, let philanthropic capital, let foundation money, let government development aid de-risk. Allow and catalyze fresh capital, allow and catalyze and leverage commercial capital, mainstream capital, and let capital then flow.
Thank you. Questions keep coming in. There is a very interesting question. I want to hear your opinion on this. One particular SDG exactly behind your head on the flag there is actually peace. 16, exactly. Could you think of ways or ideas how to create a bond for that? Because it seems to be some sort of model that truly can be used to scale in addressing different SDGs.
As I said earlier, there are three crises. There was a healthcare crisis, which went into becoming an economic crisis, and that went into becoming a humanitarian crisis. Hopefully soon, or sooner rather than later, we will have a vaccine for the healthcare crisis. The economic crisis, there is no vaccine. For the humanitarian crisis, there is a vaccine. It's called compassion. It's called peace. We need to start finding ways to incentivize that. We need to finding ways to build a just society. And whether you look at any religious tradition, you see the focus on peace. And therefore, for us, I think it's important to say, how do we build that into an instrument where you can measure outcomes? I know for a fact that there is one bond that was created for recidivism, which is to track the number of people who fall back into crime once they have been released from jail. And earlier, they found many cases of repeat offenders. And so they had to be put in higher security prisons, higher costs to the government, higher costs to the exchequer. An NGO went to them and said, whoever gets released from jail, we will work with them. We will train them, we will skill them, we will place them in jobs, we will mentor them, we will counsel their families, we will work with their colleagues. And we will give them a sense of worth, a sense of purpose. And if they fall, so earlier, say, for example, 60% would go back to jail as repeat offenders. And the government would pay another £15,000 to keep them in jail. They said, if we can save and bring that number down from 60% for every single person below 60%, then you share with us £7,500. Because Mr. Government, you are now saving £15,000. So you pay Miss NGO half of that gain. And so slowly, if we are able to create those models, we are already seeing COVID has the highest impact on the poor and on people who are of different color. And that is being established across the world. Can we create a model or a structure? And that's, there is no one solution that fits all. And therefore, the challenge is all to the bright young people, 204 who have registered and many more who will watch it on Facebook. Identify what is the model for peace that you can create something that can be measured. We have many people under trials in jails who have no money to afford a lawyer and are struggling there. Is there a model whereby we can say we will reduce the number of people who are under trial by X if we do a certain set of activities? And so building peace, building communities of justice is absolutely critical. We need to be able to think differently. We need to broaden our perspective and not think that peace means only for those who are of a certain bent of mind. It is for everyone to be able to create a new solution.
Okay, I think this answer actually also answered the question which I hadn't put to you yet, but one of the first questions is that the financial markets themselves, through these models which are advertising, will not obviously achieve these SDGs alone. You need to convince the decision makers, the politicians, different countries to come along with that. It seems that, I mean, for me at least, how to achieve that. The question was how to achieve that. Basically, is what you just said, that you can actually show this decision maker as well that, well, wait a minute, this will actually bring societal benefits, even though when you're simply looking at, let's say, in an Excel table, your costs and your resources might not seem like that, but you actually show that, wait a minute, and this is the way how to convince to come on board as well, and then use these mechanisms.
Absolutely, and we are seeing governments being changed by people voting if they feel excluded. And that's a common thread across the world. So policymakers have no choice but to sit up and notice, because more and more people are going to move towards civil unrest if they are unable to get their basic needs met. COVID is going to make things only worse. The next 6 to 12 months are going to get probably tougher before they get easier. And so it is up to the policymakers to be able to be proactive in the ways they are empowering people, in the ways they are supporting initiatives around the SDGs, in the ways they are unlocking capital. $18 trillion has been put out as stimulus. I don't even want to hazard a guess how much of that was used towards development aid stimulus at the bottom of the pyramid. And so it's important for us to be that voice to say, let's create new solutions as we build back better, rather than pumping in money on the top and we have ghost companies surviving only because of free liquidity and free injection of funding, who will then collapse if that lifeline is taken away. How do we create a new pool of entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs, focused on creating good and doing well at the same time?